Are you a young earth creationist who's worried about going to secular college? Are you worried about the evolution teacher making you think you came from monkeys? Well, you've come to the right place. Today we're going to talk to one of those evolutionary teachers. No, not that one. That one. And we're going to find out what the classroom is really like at secular college. Dr. Duff, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing great. This is a really wow. I got a little bit of experience having taught
That's
this
true.
many classes and seen this many students. So I have a few stories to tell. So I'm
Awesome.
excited about that.
Yeah, so fair warning to everyone. I have absolutely no idea what he's gonna say. So, and maybe he doesn't either. So this should be fun. Uh,
I
uh,
definitely don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. I have some ideas, but
all right, let's get
if you
into it
watched
then.
any of my videos, you know that something I don't know what's going to come up next.
All right. So, educational background and like what's your teaching experience? Tell us about that.
Well, I'm a product of Calvin College up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So that's where my father went, and that was 4 good years for a bachelor's degree in science. And then I went to the University of Tennessee. I did a master's and a PhD there, both in molecular systematics. So in the Department of Botany. So molecular systematics, in case anyone out there is wondering, is applying tools where you look at biological molecules and how similar species, families, genera, populations are to each other. So you can assess whether something is a species. So I actually determined a couple different species. I've named some species. I've reorganized some groups. So it's taxonomy work, but using biomolecules. And today that would be DNA. But I did protein work as well at that time. And then from there, I left with my PhD and I went to the Southern Illinois University, go Salukis, and I did a postdoc there for 4 years. And there I did molecular characterization of chloroplast genomes in holoparasites. And holoparasites are, holo means whole, parasite means parasites, and these are holoparasitic plants. So those are plants that parasitize other plants, plants that don't do photosynthesis, and they rob all their energy from another plant.
Hmm.
And so looked at some DNA stuff in those plants. And then from there, got the job I'm at now, which is at the University of Akron. So that's my sort of my educational background.
Okay. And what about your teaching background? So, I mean, how long have you taught people, students, all different kinds of people, I would assume?
Yeah, my 23rd year at the University of Akron. And my primary bread and butter class for the first 15 years was non-majors biology. Taught a number of other courses at the
Uh,
same time, but I started right out. I had expressed an interest on my job interview. Maybe that was a bad idea, and saying like, I love to teach, undergraduates, non-majors, really enjoy that type of class and environment. And a lot of other faculty don't like to do that, so they pretty much jumped on there like, oh yeah, Joel Duff can teach that class. And so I got started doing that, but that's really been important for me because as I look back, because it's allowed me to, because you're teaching non-biology, non-scientist, and this
mhm,
might be their only science class. And so it's like your opportunity to kind of like say, like, here's what's really great about science, what's interesting about science. Well, here's what science is,
mhm,
specifically in the area of biology. And it makes you take like a whole bunch of fundamental principles in biology and be able to communicate them to an audience that isn't like very science minded, maybe doesn't have an interest in science. you know I don't do science well, you hear a lot. And so but it helps me engage, or helped me engage with those who don't understand science well. So it makes you think about complicated topics and try to put them into simple terms
mhm.
for students. So that was the main thing I did for many years. But along the way, I teach graduate courses in molecular methods. I've taught biological systematics, which is right up my alley. I've taught a couple different plant classes. I teach
Mhm.
flora, so that's like going out and identifying plants. But lately, the last couple of years, I've been teaching general genetics out of a need in our department for teaching genetics. And so I've kind of had to learn a whole lot of genetics. to do that. And the last couple of years, I've also been teaching evolutionary biology, which we'll definitely talk about here in a few minutes. So
Right.
that's most of the teaching experience in terms of like in front of the classroom. I also teach some labs and in other types of courses as well.
Very cool. And of course, you're a Christian, but you also believe in evolution. So that'll play a big part into our conversation today. Um, but that means that you're getting, some people go to college. Many of these people, young Earth creationists, they go to your classroom. They're not going to get that like mean evolutionist trying to steal your faith kind of person. Um, Loving Joel Duff, kind and ready to give you evolution. I guess we'll find out your actual approach. But
Well, some people might disagree with that, who I disagree with on the internet, but yeah, in person, I am probably a much kinder person than I might be perceived by some people on the internet. That's probably
Okay,
true for a
and
lot of people on the internet, right?
oh, there you go. But you also you work at a secular school, right? So
Yeah,
you hear all the stories, I would assume.
yeah. I
Uh,
mean, you mean the stories of students' interactions
yeah, sure.
with faculty who may not have their, say, well, how shall we say it, their same worldview
Right,
or perspective on things.
right.
Yeah. So, if you say, do I run into young Earth creationists, or how many do I see in a classroom? Honestly, I don't see, I guess we'd have to ask, what is a young Earth creationist? And you've got your young Earth creationists who are like gung ho, true believers, right? It's something that they really truly understand, and it's really part of what makes them who they are in terms of
Mhm.
their beliefs. It's very central to their overall core beliefs. And then you have your young Earth creationists, which I would say most of the students who I would say come into classrooms at secular institutions like the one I work at, are young Earth creationists in the sense that they may have gone to a Christian school, or maybe they're homeschooled, or their church was a very heavily influenced by young Earth creationism, and so they were fed that kind of information most of their
Mm,
life, and they've heard of other things, they don't know much else, but it's also not something that's like core or central to them. There's many people who learn a lot about young Earth creationism, and it just kind of like, they're not interested in those questions, and so they don't really think about it as being something that's like super central. Like, they're not personally invested in the
mm,
topic themselves. They might call themselves, yeah, well, I believe there's young, or I don't really believe in evolution, just this general term evolution. They usually don't know what they mean by that when they say it, but
right.
they say, I don't believe in evolution, because that's what I was taught, or that's what, it doesn't the Bible doesn't seem to support those particular views. And so you'll have, I would say, well, what's interesting is over 23 years, I've seen what I think is a shift in the student body.
Hmm.
And again, I'm just speaking from my experience here at this institution,
Yeah.
and have worked at other places and been in, seen other institutions, and certainly met colleagues across the country. But still, I'm not giving an academic, like scientific survey type answer. This is sort
Right.
of like my particular experiences. But, in talking to other faculty who have similar interests to mine, they've seen the same type of thing. 20 some years ago, you could assume that, a good third of your class was like familiar with young Earth creationism,
Hmm.
at least had heard those ideas, and were certainly skeptical of the idea of evolution, even if they didn't believe in a young Earth. And so you could expect there to be a number of students in your audience. And I have a class in general biology that has 150 students. So
Wow.
there's going to be a lot of them
Yeah.
out there in that situation. But I would say over the last few years, my expectation is there's a lot fewer of them. Many of them have never even heard of it. And there's fewer and fewer obvious examples of young Earth creationists in the audience who are sort of the really vehement ones that really want to talk about the topic, right? It really is something that's very close and dear to their heart, and so therefore their antennas are up, right, when they
Yeah.
come into the class, about like, what's this professor going to say, and am I going to be challenged? And they may feel like they need to challenge somebody as well. That I don't experience, and a lot of my colleagues don't experience very often either.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, so of course, this is a really important topic because, I mean, I guess the stereotype is, a young Earth creationist, believes 6,000-year-old Earth and doesn't believe in evolution, that we all came from monkeys or whatever. And, I guess there's this fear in a lot of churches and a lot of families and homes or whatever that you're going to go to college and that atheist professor is going to he's going to be a jerk and he's going to call you out and say you're stupid on the
Yeah.
first day and he's going to talk you out of it and he's going to destroy your faith. Uh,
Yeah.
so, I mean, I kind of want to talk about that today a little bit. Um, but specifically, like, I mean, can you talk about that general vibe that like, what are most young Earth creationists that you've talked to? Like, what are they expecting when they first come to class?
Well, I first thing I'll say is uh, I've got news for everyone out there. The academic world isn't exactly like Expelled, the movie. If anyone of you is familiar with that, right? This is this movie which portrays sort of that what you're talking about. This vibe of, okay, I'm going to send my student to this secular institution, and they're going to be, attacked from all sides, and they're going to sit in this classroom, and the professor is just going to just like hammer away and tell them they're wrong about everything. And if they try to object, they're going to be made fun of, like in front of the rest of the class. Um, yes, I'm sure everyone has probably heard stories of particular professors who may have been on a mission, right, to break students of um, their particular worldview that they feel is wrong. I find that those are few and far between, right? Those stories can filter around the internet, and somebody can know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that had
Hmm.
that particular type of experience. And young Earth creationists sort of feed off of those particular stories, right, to create that perception that that's what's happening. Now, I'm not pretending that there aren't a lot of faculty that are a-religious or certainly not young Earth creationists, and so aren't going to be sympathetic toward that view. But it's also an academic environment where you have a situation where most of the faculty have been around a while, have learned about pedagogical approaches of teaching in the sense of being fair and open. Where, especially in the sciences, we tend to think of, I'm going to address this as, well, what's the evidence in this situation? And I'm not going to go beyond the evidence. And most faculty recognize that some of these topics, evolutionary biology, touch on questions that can't all be answered by science. And the faculty member might say, um, I disagree, or this is my particular view on things. But most of them really are sticking to the science. I'm sure there's a few that send off a vibe that they're, they're very strident in sort of presenting some views, and just making it sound like this is the consensus. Everybody believes this. This is what everyone believes. And so I would imagine that there are some students that feel a little bit uncomfortable, like, here's what everyone believes, and somehow I'm really different because of that. Um, but that's going to be true for, you pick a bunch of different topics, a bunch of different issues and social things. You're always going to find something somewhere where you're a little out of tune with the average person out there. And you have to be able to deal with that kind of controversy. And one thing that I find that most of my colleagues, and I hope myself, do really well is be able to allow a space for students to actually have discussion.
Hmm.
And if I could just maybe take a little tangent off of this.
Okay,
One
go for it.
interesting thing about the classroom is that when I said that some 20 some years ago, there would have been a lot of creationists or people who knew about creationism or had a creationist sort of tendency in their thinking in the classroom. And today there's not, I think, not as many. And that can make some students probably more uncomfortable today if they're young Earth creationists, because they don't have any like internal support from other students in their classroom. But I can flip this around though, and I can say that what I have found is that if you are let's say you're a Christian who goes to a Christian school, let's say you go to a Christian university or college that has a fairly strong young earth creationist strain to it. Maybe they're completely young earth creationist, or maybe they just sort of lean that particular direction. What you can end up with in those classrooms is an atmosphere where it can be very difficult actually to talk about or to express like concerns about young earth creationism. So it's almost like I don't think it's actually the opposite, because I find what I found really refreshing in the classroom that I have is that I feel like I can talk about a number of different topics. I feel like I can be welcoming to a lot of different people, and I can get people to express their opinions because it's in an environment where kind of expecting people to be different and respect other people's ability to express themselves and have different viewpoints. In a Christian college, I've often wondered what it'd be like to teach there, where in a situation where even if you're in a strongly young earth creationist environment, students who might have questions, they just like, I don't really understand this, or this really doesn't make sense to me. There can be a lot of strong peer pressure there not to talk about that, or not to ask those questions. And you can have the same kind of professors. In fact, this is going to sound terrible, but I don't have many stories of atheistic professors that I know that come in and they're just, their mission is to destroy the faith of students. Most of them are very sensitive to that, and they live in an environment where they're sensitive to a lot of different concerns, things that maybe Christians aren't sensitive to and maybe don't care to be sensitive to, particular social issues and so forth. But one thing in the university environment is the fact they are, what I found is, really careful about not having religious sort of biases or calling out or being, what's the word I'm looking for there? They're, you're gonna have to cut this because I have to remember what this word is.
Go for
it. Yeah, what's the other word from bias? I'm missing a really simple word here, but it's driving me crazy. It's like, all right, I was on a roll and I'm going to a particular point, but now it's bothering me because I can't remember this word. We'll just call it this. Faculty might have a bias, but they're very conscious of sometimes of that bias. They're trying to be very fair to students and not look like they are, preferring one student over another student. And and the sad thing is, I probably have more stories from students at Christian universities who feel essentially bullied or feel like they are being suppressed in terms of their opinion at those institutions because they're not allowed to talk about those things. Right. And the professor is very direct about like, that's, you can't believe that, that's wrong, and it's like all things we're kind of talking about, like students being scared of coming to secular institution. You can get like the reverse kind of discrimination at a secular institution. I'm sorry, a Christian institution. I said, my kids, sorry, another story. My kids, they go to a Christian school, and there's a particular teacher at this Christian school that is not a biologist, but is one of the teachers. They take it upon themselves. Like the first unit of the class is always like Christian worldview in this particular science class. And so that's where they get the young earth creationist spiel and all these things. And one thing that's happened to several of my kids is that this particular teacher knows that I work as a biologist at a secular institution. And they always point that out. And they always point out that, one of my kids has, a parent that works at this secular institution. And then they also know that, at this point that I have a blog and then I write about this topic. And they have actually expressed their concerns in class in front of all the other students about the fact that one of the kids are possibly learning, the wrong thing. To the point where other students have actually come to one of my kids and expressed their concern for their soul because they're worried about you might be learning at home. So it's it's a very awkward thing, and my kids are not. I've not like we don't really talk about this topic very much. It's hard to believe. As much as I talk about it, I don't really like beat this into my kids. It's more an exploration of what are your questions. We talk about things. They come home with questions. They ask questions about things they've heard, and they have questions, and they've tried to ask them in class, and they essentially get made fun of for having those questions. Um, and so that's something that honestly it just doesn't really happen so much in my experience in the institutions that I've been involved with. Certainly none of my colleagues would ever um, have an issue with a young earth creationist um, in class. I mean, if that young earth creationist were to express their view, now the faculty members are going to express their view back, but I don't think they're going to feel mistreated in that interaction.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, so I went to community college and took some science classes there, and the first teacher, Bio 101, he didn't even mention evolution like the entire class. And then the second one was like on taxonomy, and like that was mentioned, but like it was very short, like it was just not a big deal at all. Which of course, that's yeah, all teachers are all different or whatever, but yeah, I certainly didn't get that vibe, and neither of my siblings did when we were at any of those classes. So that's really interesting to hear, because like we were homeschooled, so we didn't know what to expect, honestly. Um, that
Yeah,
it's kind of odd that it might be more common, like unexpected, especially like our background and all. Um,
I think my students in particular are surprised. I do know that I do know because I get to know some of the students.
yeah.
And I always tell them they can come talk to me outside of class. I'm very open about because they'll realize at some point in my class that
Uh-huh.
I'm a Christian. It's not like I get up and say on the first day of class, I'm a Christian. I just want you to know that. I don't have this like spiel about that. It simply is who I am. That's going
Yeah.
to be exposed at some point during the class. And I also have anonymous Q&A days in which they can ask whatever they want. So they will often ask personal questions that
Hmm.
I give personal answers to those questions. But so all the students in the class who might come in with a sort of like, oh, what am I going to learn about this particular topic? And they're nervous, are going to hear me say things I think they're going to make them feel like, well, maybe I could talk to him. And so I have many students who've come to me after class or my office hours and have discussions on this particular topic. And I'm not saying every other faculty member do that. What happens in my college is a faculty member has a question about science and faith, or like, I'm having difficulty understanding this topic compared to things I've learned in the past. And so I'm having this conflict. It's like, well, go see Joel Duff. He's down in room, what, that, so it's like, I'm the go-to source for having those sit down discussions with students. And so I've had, literally 100 discussions with students over the years in my office on a wide range of topics, but often sort of this, here's what my background is, and you said these things. I was really surprised by that, and and they don't all walk out of the room like, oh, Dr. Duff is right. It's more like,
Yeah.
and I don't tell them, like, here's what you should believe. It's
Mm.
it's a it's a conversation about,
Hmm.
tell me what you think and what you're struggling with, and I'll give you some other perspectives and things you could read. And it's you don't have to make this decision today about all these different questions you have. This is a lifelong learning process, and the only thing you're doing in this class is you're getting some more information, and you're learning, here's what the consensus view of what maybe of evolutionary biology, of what scientists think, including a lot of Christians. And you need to make of it what you will. You need
Right.
to incorporate that into other things that you have learned, and you need to use those tools to be critical also of other things that you hear so that you can assess that knowledge.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So I mean, you said that you don't have many stories. At the same time, we want the juice. Dr. Duff. We want the good stuff.
I got to bring it strong. All right.
Yeah, bring it strong. Don't hold back any punches. Tell us what are your horror stories of things you've heard?
Oh, I'm going to be so disappointing to you.
Oh,
I just don't have any horror stories. And you might think that I do. And it's not horror story. I don't have horror stories about other people. I don't even have horror stories about myself. I have, but it's not that I don't have any stories at all. I'm just saying they're not terrible. Right.
okay,
So, but I think they'll be interesting. I think they
okay,
provide some perspective. Um, so I think it was, yeah, 2 years ago,
okay.
during the pandemic, actually, I had a class, and this is my evolutionary biology class. And I had a bunch of honor students in the class, and they have to do like some extra thing, right, to get their honors credit because it wasn't like officially an honors course, but they needed some honors credit. So I said, you know what, I'm willing to, go the extra mile to help you get this honors credit, but you've got to do this assignment. And the assignment was, find something I've said in the class, right, that piqued your interest, you wanted to know more about. It could be controversial or not controversial, but you need to write me a paper, about that. And by the end of the semester, and then we'll sit down, I'll read the paper, but you also have to come in and I have to have like a half-hour discussion about it, right? You have to have converse with me on this particular topic. So you have to show me you've advanced your knowledge well beyond something that I taught you in the class. And I got one of these papers, and I opened up the paper, and the whole paper was about what's wrong with evolution just generally, but it was about natural selection more specifically. And I'm reading through this paper, and I realized I'm skimming down the paper, and I'm thinking, I know this literature, the anti-evolution literature so well. Like I'm recognizing like every single argument in this paper. It wasn't plagiarized, but it was written well, but it certainly had all the ideas, right, that I've heard many, many times.
So
And I
basically,
go down. Yeah, go ahead.
so basically, he just like pulled up a Answers in Genesis blog and just like copied the arguments.
In this case, it was Discovery Institute.
Oh, okay.
All the references were to articles at the Discovery Institute. And Discovery Institute also has a journal, Origins Journal, and which kind of looks like a real peer-reviewed journal. And they had gone as far as actually to read and look at some of those papers as well. And I hadn't even asked them really. I hadn't really made a big deal about sources. They had to have some sources, but they were very intent on like looking at a lot of stuff. But it turns out it was like all Discovery Institute or related things because they had branched out from that, but they still fallen on the envelope of intelligent design. And so this whole thing was like this counter argument to some things that I had said in class. We talk about Paley, we talk about design, and a bunch of stuff in my class when we do a lot of talk about philosophy of science in the class. That's why it's such a fun class to teach. And students come out of there and they're like, that was so much more interesting than I thought. Had no idea that we'd learned this kind of stuff in evolutionary biology class. Oh, sorry, tangent. Yeah. So anyway, I'm skimming through this article that they had, or this paper they had written, and I see all these references, and I'm thinking, and I know this student, and it's right up front, and I knew that they're really intelligent. I'm starting thinking like I was, yeah, are they going to come in now? I gotta have this half-hour conversation. How's that going to go? Are they going to be like, you know, nervous about it? Am I going to be nervous about it? And they come in, and it turns out that he just likes to write, from English, he's always liked to write like contrary viewpoints. Like that's the way he stretches himself. It's like, can I make my best argument against something? He wasn't really necessarily opposed to anything that we had talked about in the class, but he wanted to find the best argument against it. So he didn't know anything about intelligent design or like that movement or anything like that, but he had fallen into this like area of literature, and that's what he developed from it. But then I got talking to him, and he had a friend as well that came along. I think he was just interested to see like what I was going to say. It was like, can he join us for the conversation? I'm like, yeah, okay. I was like, what am I getting myself into here now? And we get talking, and they're both Catholic by upbringing, and they really understood a bunch of doctrinal stuff, we got really talking about the Garden of Eden. We got talking about original sin. We got into a whole bunch of stuff. My half hour turned into 2 hours, of conversation that
Mm.
sort of took off on, yeah, here's all the things that, that this exploration has sort of brought up that they hadn't thought about for many, many years. Like how do all these things work? And they didn't have any strong opinion in any particular direction, but they were just fascinated to be able to learn and to be like forced to think about these things in class. That's
Interesting.
story number one.
Okay. Fascinating. So did you convince them? Are they evolutionists now?
Um, yeah, at the end of the conversation, it's like, yeah, I think most everything you said kind of makes sense, and I I don't have any objections to the science of this. But you have to understand when you say, did I convince them of
Uh,
evolution? Just like in your introduction, you said like, Joel Duff's believes in evolution.
mm,
I didn't make the look at you when you said that, but I never liked that term believe.
right.
And I say that in class too. I'm not a believer in evolution. I I find evolutionary theory and the mechanisms explored in evolutionary theory, natural selection, genetic drift, and all the various things as powerful, a powerful hypotheses and theory that does a very good job of explaining the diversity we see outside around us. And if I wanted to know why is that plant like look the way it does, and why is that animal scurrying around, why is it behaving the way it does, it provides me really powerful tools to be able to explain why that is. And that's not so much like cell to human being type evolution. It's just like explaining the inner workings of just how biology functions, but it's within this context of how organisms are adapting and changing. And I say like in class, I say like this is just really, there might be other theories, there might be other hypotheses that come along that
Mhm.
explain all of these types of things better, might give you a better explanation for it. And so at the moment, I find it is the best, you know, it's the best way of explaining naturalistically how these things could occur. And I think my students in my class kind of get the vibe like, okay, well, I'm very careful about using word naturalistic, and these are, these are mechanisms that work and that we can investigate with scientific tools. And obviously, there are questions that we can't really address with scientific tools at times. So there are other potential answers to some of these questions. Um, I would say for what I've got. Oh yeah, and I'm sure we had that kind of discussion. I had that kind of discussion with those two students. About this isn't all or nothing. This is
Mhm.
this is a really you have to recognize the power of evolutionary theory to explain a lot of aspects of the physical world around us. You might choose to say, in my views of this doctrine or my views of from scripture and my interpretation of that, I can't accept certain aspects of the entirety of this massive thing you might call evolution, which is like some kind of global explanation for everything, which is the way I think young earth creationists try to like present it as like it's all, you got to take it all in.
Mm.
But the origin of life, that's a really complex question. And there's no reason, it's the world is complex and life is complex, and integrating the physical world with the metaphysical, non-physical world that we believe exists is not a simple and trivial thing that anyone thinks they should just have the answer for in a couple minutes with a discussion with a professor.
Mhm.
And so I always treat it as, here's some perspectives and here's some things you need to know. And you need to just understand these ideas, because these ideas are widespread and well accepted. And it it's it wouldn't be smart not to understand at least what evolutionary biology is suggesting.
Mhm. Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know me. I got to use that slang. Um,
Yeah.
if you guys want to learn more about that, Dr. Duff and I talked about that a lot on our previous interview on Young Earth Creationism.
Our
Strongly recommend
previous
checking that one out.
encounter.
Oh snap! So, kind of on that topic, I wanted to ask you, so like, a lot of people are afraid of going into the evolutionary professor's classroom. At the same time, another thought that a lot of people have is once you get in there, how are you gonna, how is the young Earth creationist going to talk to the professor? Is he gonna, yell at him? That's not true.
Am I just going to cut you
That's, oh,
off?
yeah, right.
Am I
Is
going to
that
make
gonna
it
be
seem
it?
like you just shouldn't even ask a question?
Yeah, well, well, that's that whole discussion, and then or the more reserved way where you don't tell them you're a young Earth creationist, but you write papers to him for assignments disproving evolution like covertly, or third option, you pretend like you're an evolutionist just to get the A, but you're not. So, like, for example, my sister, really, really smart person, and she got 4.0s in all her college, young Earth creationist, and her biology teacher was like, well, you really understand this. And then, she comes home, she's like, boy, she doesn't know that I'm a young Earth creationist. I fully understand the evolution and, whatever. And, like, there's an interesting thing, psychology, sociological thing going on there. But from a teacher perspective, like, what do you request of your students? Do you make them like give you what you want to hear, or how does that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it kind of goes back to one of those first questions about like how many young Earth creationists are there in the classroom, or how do I, what's happening? How many are coming in?
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is you don't really know, right? Because of
Mm-hmm.
just the things you just said. Some of them just will never say a word, and they might be excellent students, and they look like they're just, I look at them, they look like they're taking it all in, and they seem to be enjoying the topic. And then you do find out later potentially that, you know, it's just kind of like one in one ear, out the other. And I memorized what I needed to memorize and wrote the answers down. Um, Although that's a little hard to do in my class and pass the class, just memorize information. You really have to integrate. You really have to be able to take information and be given a problem, basically, and be able to apply a bunch of different ideas to give a plausible explanation for something. But back to your point. Um, so what I would do in my class, so this is true for my non-major. So let me talk about my non-majors class real
Yeah.
quick. So in my non-majors class, that's kind of a walkthrough biology. And as you said, you could take that class and maybe evolutionary biology isn't a central component of it at all. And some faculty might just choose to avoid the topic. There are faculty who really don't want to deal with students who might. The other option you didn't give was they might go through the class, not say a thing, and the way they give feedback is the student evaluation form, right, which is anonymous, and then they write out like this whole like book for you about everything you did wrong and how they hate what you said. And then you just don't know where it came from, you don't know who it was. um, and there are faculty they're, I think, deathly afraid of those kind of interactions, because some at some institutions those types of responses can be problematic in terms of you getting tenure or whatever, right? Yeah, and so it
Mm.
might affect your raise. And so there is a sociological effect there, even on the faculty member side, of maybe fearing certain topics and sort of avoiding them. Um, I don't think that that's really much the case these days. But I'm sorry, now I've gone off on a tangent. I probably lost where I was. So, oh yeah. So, what do I do in my non-majors class? All right, yeah, in my non-majors class, what would the experience be like for an undergraduate student, usually a freshman? Like they're just coming into college. Maybe it's their first semester. I'm doing fall semester, and I've got 200 students in my class. Right. So just the very fact I have 200 students means that there's going to be some limited ability to have like direct interaction with me. Um, I have office hours, but most freshmen are very intimidated. They're not really interested in coming to that as much as I try to say, like, I'm really friendly. Come see me. I'd love to talk to you. But so students are coming to the class. So how do I make it such that they feel like they understand what I want them to know? And how do I enable students with a wide variety of different viewpoints coming in? Because you remember, this isn't just young Earth creationists that are in the classroom that are like maybe have questions about this
Mm-hmm.
thing called evolution, which they may not know what it is, right? There's students that come from other different worldviews besides a fundamentalistic Christian background, right? And so there's plenty of ways to offend a lot of different people, in that classroom when you get talking on this subject. So how do I sort of accommodate different views and allow students to express themselves and enable them to ask questions that I think they deserve to be able to ask in a college setting, in a college class, because here's the information that's being imparted to them. Here's what
Mm-hmm.
they're being asked to learn, but how do they get to interact with it? So here's what I do. So I there's one section of the course which is about the diversity of life and classification, and the importance of just having an appreciation for just how many different things and how many different species there are in the world. And of course, then that leads to the question of like,
Mm.
why are there so many different species? Why are there so many beetles, but there's only 3 different kinds of elephants? And basic biology, a basic fundamental thing in biology would be, if you're curious about biology, would be like, yeah, why is that? Well, what governs that? What determines that? And you could say God made it that way. He just decided there's going to be 2 elephants, there's going to be 100,000 different beetles, and just made it exactly so. Or evolutionary biology provides a potential explanation from a perspective of naturalistic perspective of how that could have occurred, how that could have come about, and what maintains that particular diversity. Right. All this, sorry, long preamble to be able to say that I get to this particular unit in the class, and I usually have some kind of spiel at that point where I say, I know, like we got a couple lectures coming up on this topic, evolutionary biology, or the origins of diversity, or something like that. And I say, I know we got this section coming up, and you might be wondering, like, what's this professor going to say? Like, what's he going to say about this stuff? What's he going to tell you? You must believe. And I say right away, I'm not going to tell you anything you must believe. I'm simply going to present to you the um, the biological theories that have been proposed to explain the reasons for
Mm.
diversity on this earth. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to present to you. I don't think I'm going to present anything to you that's actually going to sound all that controversial. And you're going to be a little bit surprised when we go through this at how uncontroversial it really is. Because most of you have one idea of what evolutionary biology is in your head, and you're thinking it's all about chance molecules and making the original cell and then somehow making cells into human beings. And although certainly that's encapsulated in the idea, the extension of evolutionary theory into like how far could it go in terms of explaining all the diversity on the world. But that's not really what we're going to do in class. We're going to talk about natural selection. We're going to talk about mechanisms for how organisms are adapting to the environment around us. And we might say, here's how it could explain things over long periods of time and the diversity of fossils that you see. But 95% of what we're going to learn, you're not going to find controversial. You're probably going to say like, oh, really? That's, what that is. So I kind of try to set them at ease just to let them know that this is just something that I think everybody needs to know about. You need to know what evolutionary theory, you need to know what evolutionary biologists are saying, and not be told by somebody else who is an anti-evolutionist or doesn't believe in evolution. You need to allow yourself to learn what biologists in general think that this thing evolution is and how it functions. Just because you need to understand it so that you can communicate to others about it and have intelligent conversations about it. And so it's not about believing it; it's about
Mm.
simply understanding the principles of it. All right, so that's just the beginning. Then we have some lectures, and then I have a Q&A session, and sometimes I have 2 Q&A sessions. And what my Q&A session is this: it's an anonymous Q&A. I give them all index cards the day before this particular class period, and I tell them they can write down any question they want about me. About any topic we've discussed in the class. And of course, we're doing this right after talking about evolutionary biology. So I know that a lot of the questions are be about evolutionary biology. And I tell them, I say, you know what? I don't want you to think that I've cherry picked information because this is a huge topic. I teach a whole class for a whole semester. And even after that semester, I think they really need like 3 more
Hmm.
semesters to actually understand this topic fully,
Hmm.
more fully. And I'm only giving you 4 or 5 lectures, right? So this is a huge topic, a huge field that you could study for an entire graduate degree, and you're getting a couple weeks. I don't want you to feel like that in my shortcut summary, right, in
Hmm.
which I've just given you the basics here, that I have cherry picked like what I think you should know, and that I've avoided the hard questions, and that I am not talking about some things, and I am picking information that fits something that I am trying to convince you of, right? And so I don't want you to feel like you can't ask those questions. So what I'm doing is you can ask me anything you want, and I have to try to answer it. And you could go out and you could say, like, I saw this on Facebook. You know, maybe you don't want to like say you are asking the question yourself. You could say, like, I saw this on Facebook. You know, somebody said that blah 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 is a really good reason why evolution isn't true, or this particular aspect of evolution doesn't work. Challenge, right? Sometimes I call it stump the professor day, right? This is your chance to like ask whatever you've always wondered about too. Like, you just, people have questions, like, I've always wondered, how does that work? Or how did you get that? Or I hear people say this about evolution. Is that true? What do you think about that? And inevitably, what also comes up is like, well, what about Adam and Eve?
Hmm.
I get a lot of questions about that. Really? I get a lot of questions about what about humans evolving? I get questions about chimpanzees and humans. And I also get questions about origin of life. I get questions about dinosaurs, you know, the works. And it's it's a time for them to pretty much just force me to answer something rather than me being the one up there just telling them information. And almost always the students really enjoy this particular time. And then I have a couple of lectures afterwards, and you know what happens is they haven't really talked all semester. They're very quiet, they're timid because they're usually freshmen. And then after I do the Q&A session, it's like everyone's got questions after that, because it's like I try to demonstrate in doing my Q&A time that I'm not simply here like preaching to them, but I'm taking their question, I'm taking it seriously, I'm listening to their concern. And then I'm saying to myself, and then what I present to them is I don't say, like, well, here's the answer. I say, here is what I know a bunch of people would say to that. Here's what I think the consensus answer to that question would be based on all the scientific evidence that I know about, right? All the different work that's been done. And I might also then point out, here's what I think are, um, here are stumbling points. Here, I recognize in your question, this is where people struggle. And I'll give like, here's like 2 or 3 different ways people have tried to understand this. Because sometimes there's a lot of questions that do bridge on that science and faith thing. And one reason I do this as well is because at a secondary institution, I'm not really going to just come out and talk about my particular
Hmm.
views or perspectives on things as part of my lecture. But if asked a question about it, I don't feel like that's, you're asking me personally about that. I'm going to respond, and I try to do that very much so in a like, here's things that I think about when I'm thinking about this particular question, and here's answers. So I give a perspective of different views when I do that, and it's a really usually a fun time. It's super stressful for me at times, and I've heard most of the questions now, but that doesn't mean I always have good answers to them. It's also good for me because it's a good exercise in, you know, doing things like this. You're going to get asked questions and maybe you don't know what the question is. Can you take, and I even frame it to the students this way. I said, you're going to ask me about something that I've never thought about before. You know, I don't know about that particular organism or that particular feature of that organism or how this happened or whatever, right? And you're going to ask me about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all my general biology knowledge about how biology functions, and I'm going to draw up a hypothesis for you based on that. And it's going to be a reasonable hypothesis. I can't tell you it's, you know, it's been vetted and it's a theory and it's actually accurate, but I'm going to show you how you can take disparate pieces of information that you've learned and come up with an answer. Because isn't that what we're doing in college? Aren't we learning a whole bunch of information and ways to think about information, integrating information? Because you can't just memorize everything you're going to
Mm.
need to know the rest of your life, right? You can't just, what you're going to do is you're going to go out into the workforce and you're going to be confronted with something kind of different than something you learned. And what you have to do is integrate all the things you've learned and figure out how to solve that particular problem. And we do that in biology too. We do that in science. I can't know everything about the area of biology. I don't even know everything about some subdisciplines in the area of biology. But I can infer a lot of things about how something might work because I understand the general principles of biology. And if I understand the general principles of how organisms adapt in their environment, I'm also able to then come up with rational, reasonable, potential answers to questions that I've never been asked before and I've never actually read about before. And so I treat it as an exercise for showing students how they should be thinking about what learning is and how to apply learning, and how generating this base of knowledge as they're taking their classes is helping them become somebody who can think and integrate knowledge
Mm.
later in life. Sorry,
No, I
long
appreciate
answer to that.
it. So yes or no question. On your tests, do you say is evolution true, true or false? Is that on your tests?
Never asked that question.
Okay.
I would never ask anything that's like that. You know, I would I would ask it. I would ask questions as to um, scientists. Which of the following pieces of evidence do scientists feel is the most compelling for
Mm,
common ancestry or something like that? And here's four examples of things we talked about, one of which is not a very good, some of which are not actually compelling reasons why anyone should believe in common ancestry, but maybe
mm,
another one is. And that's one we talked about in class, and I explained why these particular things develop that idea and are evidence of common ancestry. But it's not asking them, do you think it's
mm,
true that all organisms have common ancestry? But
mm,
what is the best evidence for it? I think they should be aware of what the best
mm.
evidence
Yeah,
is.
when I went to Liberty, I had a theology class, and like, of course, you get Calvinism, Arminianism, all that kind of stuff in there, and like on the test, it was like basically saying like, is this view true? It's like, how do you answer that?
Hmm.
And it was a really weird question. I got to be
Yeah,
in the
that's
class. So I don't know if that helped or hindered it. Another one though at Liberty, just
well, all those answers are
yeah.
true to you. So, I mean,
I
you should have gotten
appreciate that.
100%.
I'll let the teacher know. Uh, 8 years later or whatever. Also another one. Someone posted on Facebook. It was like a resurrection question. Jesus' resurrection is like, are we justified in believing that all of the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead? It's like, are we justified? Like that seems like a completely personal question, or like, how do you? That was at Liberty. It was
Yeah.
like really weird. Like,
Yeah.
where are these questions coming from? Um,
No, and I think I can speak for a lot of colleagues I know that they wouldn't ask those
mhm,
types of questions either. Um, because it's about
mhm,
weighing evidence and which one has the greatest amount of evidence. And we wouldn't ask a question about like, well, which has more evidence? This theological construct for how to understand this, or this scientific one. We're not going to what's the word?
juxtapose. Yep, there you go.
Juxtapose. Yeah, there we go. We're not going to juxtapose those two things with each other and ask students to choose, right? What we're going to do is we're going to juxtapose different ideas that people have for how to explain the observations we've made in this world, physical observations. And here's somebody's hypothesis for how to explain that particular set of data, and somebody else has a different idea. And you might have to come up with like, based on what I know, this one appears to have greater support because it fits,
Mm,
it has these particular sets of support, and this
mm.
other one lacks support, right? they had bad sample sizes, and so I can't really trust their particular data set anyway, or something like that. Right. So we're not really asking those kind of, not trying to ask those type of metaphysical questions. It is a science class, and in a way, I find being able to teach science is kind of an advantage over maybe teaching
Mm.
history or philosophy or a religion course or political science. I mean, you're going to get into all kinds of thorny issues over there, um, and you're debating ideas, and you don't really have a mechanism to decide which ideas. Well,
Yeah.
you don't have the same kind of mechanism to decide which idea is right, whereas in science we can just say, look, come with the, bring your evidence. It's like, here's all my observations, and here's my
Mm.
logic, and lay it out. And that's not always
Mm.
convincing to everyone, but at the end of the day, you're still only answering questions
Mm.
that science can answer.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, uh, no horror stories, sadly. Sorry, guys. Uh,
Yeah, sorry about that.
you already told us you're approaching classes. d- uh, what are your requirements for tests? You already talked about that. Do you have any students that are like, I'm going to prove that teacher wrong? Like, how often does that happen?
um Very, very rarely. Very rarely. I don't have, I have never had a student like exclaim in class, like ask a question that sounds like they're just like, you're wrong, and I'm just trying to
Mm.
get you with a gotcha question. Um, it's kind of, maybe that's kind of surprising, because like Answers in Genesis and other creationist groups, they put out all these videos and things like that that make it sound like, here's the question, were you there? And you should ask these types of questions of your teachers. And yet I never hear those questions. Now, one reason for that is, I think, as I said before, I don't think you could take my class without
Mm.
realizing that I'm religious, and that I am sensitive to the concerns of students who have, that
Mm.
are religious. And I think that I don't have a caustic, off putting, way of approaching things, right? I feel like students find that I'm very open, and they feel like if they really had
Mm.
a gotcha question, they feel like
Mm.
they could come and talk to me. Like I said, I have many students who come talk to me, and I've had, in private conversations, I've had students ask me fairly pointed questions, but they're always in a very polite manner. And again, maybe they didn't intend to be polite originally, but maybe my style leads to them being more polite. And that kind of goes to another question I think we're going to get to, which is sort of the approach, students
Mm.
should use with faculty to be able to
Mm.
have intelligent conversations with them. And that involves
Mm.
their attitude as well. I mean, of course, you're always reading the faculty member and sort of what feedback you're probably going to get. Um, but yeah, I don't have I've never had those types of interactions in any of my classes, and I hardly ever hear stories about that in
Yeah.
any of my
Well, I was
colleagues'
gonna say it's
classes
because
either.
like, I mean, obviously, like I think that if you treat your students with love and like you're really there to help them out. You're not trying to like prove them or anything. Like they're gonna notice that, they're gonna respect you for that, and they're not gonna like treat you like you're, some teacher to prove wrong or whatever. But I don't know. Maybe you said that you don't hear about that often at all. So maybe that's just.
Well, I do get student evaluations, and I have written comments there, and I will have a few. I have had students who have told me. Well, I
Okay.
get a couple different kinds of responses. I get I came in, I was nervous. I have responses that say, I was nervous coming to class. I didn't know,
Mm.
sort of what I was going to hear. I didn't know what we were going to talk about. But the way you talked about it, I found I really enjoyed the topic. I learned a lot. I don't necessarily
Mm.
agree with everything you said, but I really
Sure.
appreciated the course. I have had a few that have just gone on little mini rants about, like, I was wrong about something. And it's obviously they were up, something
Huh.
really touched them, right? That they were upset about something, but they never confronted with they
Mm.
didn't confront me in class about that. And that part of that is, honestly, it could be peer pressure too, because you're going to stand up or say something in
Yeah.
class in front of a bunch of peers, which today, that goes back to what I started out talking about, which is 23 years ago, you could assume that a larger portion of your class was probably more influenced and by young Earth creationism, or at least was more religious, right? Had a stronger Christian foundation, biblical foundation. And now in our present society, we just have fewer people that know, like, what even young Earth creationism is, or have an idea that that is an interpretation of Scripture, or even knows the biblical story at all. I have also had comments where students are upset that I even talk about, like, even I even answer questions about creationism, because I get a lot of questions about young Earth creationism in those anonymous question days. And part of the reason I get that is because I do actually talk about Ken Ham, and I talk about young Earth creationism as I present sort of an alternative viewpoint. I'm not like, here's something else you could think about. I actually present it as, you've probably seen me actually talk about this. It's sort of the thing of the challenge to the class. I say, like, I understand that many of you don't want to, you just like, you don't want to accept common ancestry of all living things. And I kind of go through that sort of like tree model. I actually have an image, and it has like a tree with lots and lots of little branches and little tips. And I say all the tips are different species. And, some people, you have to make a choice. It's not me. I'm giving you some options, but you have to make the choice. You might believe that all the tips represent what God made. And I think there are students that come into the class, they don't really understand anything. They just know that God made everything right at the beginning, and he made all the kinds, and they think kinds are species, right? And so they think that, okay, there's 100,000 species I've talked about, and every single one of those was made just like they are that we see today by God. And I point out, I say, that is one, belief system you could have. But I will say that most people that have thought about this, that are creationist or religious, right, they're fundamentalist, that are Christians, most Christians that have thought about this don't actually think that, right? And so even some of the students that come in have misconceptions about what creationists believe, right? What they've been taught, or think they've been taught. And so I say, well, let's go down this branch. There's a branch between a coyote and a wolf, and there's a common ancestor there. And I can pretty much see that almost everyone in the class goes, yeah, you're right. There was a common ancestor to a wolf and a coyote. And then I say, well, what about, an African wild dog? Well, yeah, there's probably a common ancestor to that. And then, we just keep going back. I keep saying, well, at some point you have to make your decision. Like, if you don't believe in evolution, right, and you don't think that everything evolved from a common ancestor, then what you're telling me is that some things have evolved to some extent. Coyotes and wolves have evolved from common ancestors, but but they don't have an ancestor. So you have to find your ancestor. Where do you think your ancestor stops? And for human beings, creationists all have the same answer, but for everything else, everybody has a different answer. And that's one of the things I actually talk about in class, just to point out how hard this question is. It's not a matter of it's evolution or creationism. There's sort of like this wide swath in between. And even Ken Ham, of course, this because you've talked to Marcus Ross, but you know that Ken Ham is really upset about some creationists that are accepting too much evolution. All it means is they're taking that notch down of common ancestry maybe a little bit farther than he thinks it should go. So it's just different variations of how much evolution are you going to accept. And so that's one thing that I think all of my students see in the class, is that virtually everybody accepts that there's natural selection, that there's genetic drift, that there's mutations happening, that organisms are adapting to the environment, that one species can make two species, and there's all these different ways that can happen. And so they kind of see like, oh yeah, all this stuff does really happen. And then all you're left with is, how far back can I go and find common ancestors? And I don't really talk about that a lot in class. I don't really push the whole universal common ancestor thing, because I don't think that's really that important of a topic. I think it's really about understanding like how the world functions today, how the diversity we get has happened over the last, thousands of years, what's really happening in this world. And they can see that with their eyes. And that's why I tell them it's not going to be that controversial. You're going to have to ask yourself where the controversial points are, and ask yourself what stops common ancestry from not being true. What evidence would you need to convince yourself of that? And if that evidence is, I have to abide by a particular interpretation of scripture in order to hold these particular doctrines and uphold my faith, well, then maybe you're going to have to stop at some point. You have to say, like, canines can't be related to cats. But other of you might think that canines and cats might have a common ancestor, but carnivores don't have a common ancestor. So don't get too upset when somebody else says something that you think is evolution, because you probably also accept a whole bunch of evolution. You just don't know it, except now you know it after you've taken the class.
And this is why you got people like Marcus Ross, who's a micro or who's a young Earth evolutionist, that's ruining the hearts and minds of lots of young Earthers. Um, you know, um,
Yeah, I know. And you've talked to him, and he is so articulate, and he would be very sensitive
yeah.
in a class, and he would answer questions. Like, if I was a not a young Earth creationist, but I was going to a college and he was the professor there and he was teaching creationism, he would listen to other views. He would answer those questions, and he would give here's a way that I think you can try to understand this
Mm,
within a perspective of young Earth creationism. At the end of the day, you'd say, I understand that you could also interpret the evidence this other way. Now that's different than Ken Ham's version of young Earth creationism and his
sure.
apologetic, his method. It's just, you must believe this, and don't ask questions. We've answered it, right? We have all the answer books, and so just go look up the answer.
Yeah.
But that's not what college is about. I think that's why it's so difficult for him to understand and accept that that college professors who are at Christian colleges aren't exactly in tune with his type of apologetic, his way of teaching young Earth creationism, which is not one of questions and exploration and like examining different hypotheses. It's about, like, well, we have the answer, so why should
Hmm.
even ask questions?
Hmm. Yeah. You should make a video on that sometime. Maybe add it to your list of 200 videos. Yeah.
I'll add it to my list of 400 other videos I've got to work on. Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
should. That's a good topic.
Okay. So yeah, comment in the description if you want Dr. Duff to talk about that. We'll get a poll. Yeah. So okay, what do you think is the best approach for students to take if they disagree with their evolutionary teacher?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I think it. I think, first of all, um, I rarely find that any kind of, like, I'm just going to stick it to
Mm,
this fact line or this teacher, right? I'm so convinced of my truth, and everybody else needs to hear it, right? So I am going to, every time chance I get, I'm going to say something that's going to contradict something that the teacher is saying. That's sort of the view you get in some of these videos that have been put out by
mm,
some creationist organizations, that you need to stand up and you need to, like, oh, here's my data, you can't answer this, you can't answer this, you can't answer, well, what about this? And then always in those movies or videos, what happens is you see the teacher up front looking like, I wasn't expecting other questions, like, I only knew the things I'm supposed to say, and they caught me off guard, and I don't really have the answers to those things. And then all of a sudden everyone else in the class is like, wow, look at that, they don't really know that much and they can't really answer these questions, so maybe there are other
mm,
viewpoints that I should be considering. I can tell you that that might happen in some classrooms somewhere, probably with an adjunct professor that's teaching the class for the first time. But it's not going to happen in my class. I mean, I've heard every single gotcha question, right? I've talked about them all. That's what a lot of my students don't realize when they do the anonymous question day, because they do ask some of those gotcha questions at that point, is that I know all those questions and I already have
oh, so
I
you're
have
Ken
the
Ham.
answers. I'm really nice about it, but I think they're always surprised. It's like, oh yeah, I give all, I just go into a big thing and I use their question to, like, explore a concept, and demonstrate, the
Mm,
misconception behind the question. That's my big thing, is trying to identify
mm.
what is someone's misconception behind the question. But back to your question, because that was an important question. Like, how should students approach things? Um, Students should, just like I think they approach most every topic that might be controversial. If you want to be heard, um, you need to be a good listener, right? It's just like a conversation. If you come into a conversation and you just think the other person is wrong, but you're unwilling to hear anything that they say, that conversation is probably not going to go well, right? It's going to go like most internet YouTube debates, right? There's just going to be a lot of talking over each other. And that can happen if you have a faculty member that's kind of, maybe they were willing to listen, but if you just attack them and they feel attacked, chances are that interaction is probably not going to go very well. So I think from a young earth creationist perspective, a young earth creationist is a Christian. And I think that they should take on characteristics of being a Christian. First of all, should be a good student, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be like an A student. It just means you have to be an attentive student. You have to actually maybe have talked to the faculty member about maybe other topics. So you're not just like, I never talked to you, I never came to class. Then you had this one lecture on this one topic that I care about. I came in and I made a big deal about it. That's, I would be able to deal with that, but I think there's a lot of faculty who wouldn't be able to deal with that, right? They would be like, who are you? You decided to come in this particular classroom, this particular day and this particular time. You obviously are on a mission and you just want your particular voice to be heard. And that wouldn't even be fair to the other students in the class if you co-opted all that time either. So I think what you need to do is you need to gain the respect of the faculty member. And if you have the respect of the faculty member as an intelligent student who knows how to think through things and obviously has done well understanding other material, and you simply don't agree with them on a particular topic, and you ask them questions about it, could you explain this to me? And let me tell you why I feel like you're wrong, or that maybe you haven't demonstrated your point very well, and I would just like a chance to be able to rebut that. I think most faculty would be willing to have that conversation with a student that seemed like they want to have a conversation. So that would be my big thing. It's the kind of the attitude of the student. And it's the same thing. I think faculty ought to have the right attitude towards students in accepting that they're not all going to have the same ideas when they come in the classroom, and they're come from different places and they have different concerns. And I don't know what all those concerns are. And I just need to be sensitive to all of those. I know I'm sounding like kind of like a liberal pansy or something when I say it that way, but there's just general basic good manners and truth
Yeah.
to respecting each other
Yeah, well, no, it's
in life.
interesting. Like those videos you mentioned, just recently, Guts It Given did a video on like the little mini series, I guess from younger the
Oh yeah,
okay,
from Genesis
I don't even know what it was
Apologetics.
honestly from, but yeah,
Yeah.
like the teacher's like, oh, I don't have an answer to that, and that's what like I don't know. I mean, sure, I'm sure there's some that happens sometimes out there, but honestly, like. Um, what I would expect is the teacher's gonna feel embarrassed if, like, they actually do feel challenged. If they do, they're gonna feel embarrassed. Like, they're gonna like double down. Like, they're gonna get mad. They're gonna give you a bad grade. You're gonna be on their bad list.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
human nature.
and
Yeah.
like that's just not. I don't know any situation where that's gonna work out well. Um, but with that being said,
I have genetic
genetic
students
students,
like
yeah,
that. I teach genetics, and they're almost all pre-med students.
okay.
So they're going to medical school. Genetics is a really important class for them, and it's a very intensive class, huge amount of content. But my knowledge of genetics is not infinite by any means. And so I have students that are exceptional memorizers, right? They know every single molecule that's part of transcription and translation. They know every trans factor and element, right? And I can't remember all those things. And I have students who are just like, they know it all, but then if I don't get somebody, they have to, Dr. Duff, that's like TF2D, not TF2C. It's like, that's not really important to point out, but they feel like
Yeah.
they want to look smart.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry,
I
that's
mean that
tangential
it's
to what we're
that's
talking
somewhat
about
related.
here.
Um, yeah. So on the other hand, though, I don't know if like they're not. I don't think this idea of like we're gonna prove the teacher wrong is actually an attempt to, you know, convince the teacher. Like honestly, like nobody's expecting to convince the teacher. I think it's like a maybe an audience thing. Um, and
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
guess I mean, does that do you think that changes the answer at all? Like it should our approach change?
Well, yeah, I always answer. Well, speaking
Uh-huh.
as a teacher, when I get questions, they always say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a bad question." I've heard some bad questions, but the challenge is to take any question and turn it into something that
Mm,
everybody can learn from, right? So I really actually enjoy that challenge, especially in my non-majors biology class. You get some wacky questions. And the thing is, can I find either what the misconception of the question is without like calling that person out
mm,
and saying that they're dumb, right? It's just like that's a really interesting question. I think what's happening here is you're conflating this with that, or whatever. And but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say I'm going to make this a teachable moment, not for the person who asked the question, but I'm really making a teachable moment for everybody else. So if anyone ever does ask questions like these anonymous question days, and they're asking kind of a very personal question, or they want to know the answer for them, and they want me to know that they have this question they think I can't answer. Um, I don't just answer their question. I try to put it in the perspective of like, how does this fit in the bigger area of biology, and what can we learn, from this
mm,
question? And that usually also deflates any kind of tension that's possibly in the room too. And it also deflates the idea of a student that's just doing a kind of a performative act, right? They just want the attention, or they want to feel like, you know, they may have, they're really hyped up on young Earth creationism and
mm,
they think they have all the answers. And I'm not going to just shoot them down. I'm going to try to, tell them where they
mm,
might need to rethink that question. And usually that is, you haven't really thought through that whole thing, because if you followed out your trail of thought, that's going to lead to X, Y, and Z problems. And I even toss in
mm,
usually a theological problem too. And that's my way of showing them that I understand
mm,
there's other things, there's other questions here, right? And there's other things behind your question besides
mm,
just the question
yeah.
about science. So all of those things provide a classroom context in which students um, generally enjoy listening to those answers because they're
Mm,
all getting something out of it. There's always somebody in the classroom who's like, why are we even talking about this creationism thing? In other words, the biggest problem students in the class might be the ones that are like completely like we don't even need to even think about creationism because that's just stupid. And my answer to that is, when I even get, I sometimes have questions that actually insinuate that. And what I point out to them is, I didn't talk about how young Earth creationism is something that still a large portion of the American population believes and is influenced by, and therefore it's something you shouldn't be ignorant about. Just like I'm asking the young Earth creationists in the room to say, I think you need to understand something about evolutionary theory, like what the
mm,
actual theory says. um, those who don't believe in creationism, I think you also need to understand something about what creationists believe, because you have misconceptions as
mm,
well. And I know young Earth creationists, and I understand their theological concerns and their reasons for
mm,
behind their beliefs, right? And I'm sympathetic to some of those hermeneutical issues and theological issues. And so I can usually respond in a way that shows the young Earth creationists in the room, yes, I get why these are important questions for you. And I also am good about telling them, just like I think I mentioned earlier, for students that come talk to me, this isn't about, here's the answer, right? Here's, okay, today is your day in which you have to choose slides. No, in fact, you'd be a fool. I've even said this to classes. I say, you'd be you would this it would not be smart of you to listen to 3 lectures and then just completely abandon some view you've held for many years and just like say, okay, I was totally wrong. and I'm just going to go all the way over here and I'm going to believe this other thing. Right? I don't want that, because we know that that's doesn't usually work out well for people when they have to transition that kind of amount of
Mm.
worldview stuff over in a very short period of time. I'd say it's lifelong learning. This is you're going to go through stages where you have a bunch of different questions, and all those questions won't be answered by a single
Mm.
thing or a single model. Um, I don't have all the answers. Like, Zach, do not ask me all of your like hardest questions, because I don't have the answers to all those questions. I have some ideas, but I know that I've changed my mind as I have read more and thought more. I've evolved over time in my thinking, and I don't expect that to ever change. And the only time I will be able to tell you the answer is in the next life, right? And then I will have the answers
Mm.
for you.
All right. Let's see here. Uh, Top 10.
Hey, let
Okay.
me let me say one more thing
Mm.
about students in the classroom, and just um, how should I put this? Dealing with students who are upset or
Mm.
maybe have different views. I have a completely different interaction that's not about young earth creationism, but I think it illustrates the teacher or faculty, professor, student interaction. I had a just a couple years ago. I had a Chinese student in my class. It was during the pandemic. I think it was probably
Okay.
fall of 2020. And this particular student, I had talked to multiple times outside of class and office hours, helping her through some things. And in my genetics class, we talked about coronavirus, of course, because that was going on, and so I had a lot of updates on that. And I had talked about coronavirus, and I talked about some of the molecular genetics of it, the genome, and like how we assess the sequence and compare that sequence to other sequences from other organisms to figure out the origin
Mm.
point of different viruses. And she showed up at my door a few days later, and she was like visibly kind of shaking. And I was like, "Come on in, sit down. What do you want to talk about?" And she was just like so nervous. And she told me, like, "Dr. Duff, I have to tell you that you're wrong about everything you said, in class, and I'm really offended. Like, I don't even know whether I can even say this because I'm just so upset. You've just like, I just can't believe that you said those things, and I feel really offended. Um, you know, and she said, I feel really offended as a Chinese student.
Mm.
Um, and I'm thinking, what did I say? Like, I didn't call it the China flu or any kind of provocative term that some other people might use, right? I was just explaining the science of coronavirus and how it functions and what it does and what the latest evidence was. And she was just in tears trying to tell me
Mm.
how upset she was with me, because she's like, I really like you. I've learned so much from you, but I don't know if I can respect you anymore. And I'm trying to figure out, like, what I'm going through my head, like, what did I say? Like, what did I do in this class that set her off so much? And she proceeded to tell me after that as I was asking her, like, so what did I say? Well, then she explained to me, well, you said that the virus originated in China, like, maybe from bats or, somewhere in China, in the Wuhan region. And she said, well, that's absolutely false. That virus was made in the United States or possibly in Russia, and it was blamed on the Chinese, and we've been been given all this grief for that. And she really believed it. Like, she totally believed that the coronavirus had nothing to do with China. um, and I knew from talking
Mhm.
to some other students that this is something that the Chinese students had been told by various people in the Chinese government. And she was seriously taking her role as like a representative of Chinese visiting here
Hmm.
to set me straight. Like, I got the official Chinese government version of what the real truth was. Um, Now, that's a really interesting situation because here you have somebody who's completely convinced that they're right and they're confronting me on
Mm,
something I've said in class, and they really feel offended, like offended as a like
mm,
racially offended in a way, like I've impugned their country
mm,
and their nationality. So I had a I you know I talked to her. I apologized if I said anything that was I didn't mean anything by that. And then I tried to explain to her that I'm simply relaying to you what is the consensus view of most people who have studied the DNA, the sequences, and so forth. I'm not thinking of it at all in terms of a political perspective or anything like that. And we got talking about how there's different viewpoints, and obviously there's even different views about the
mm,
origin in China itself, right? There's debates about that. And I even said in class, I don't know exactly what the origin is, but here's different hypotheses, and here is the predominant hypothesis based on the observations we have today. So I took it as a lesson, as a way to start talking about, like, how can we have a conversation in which you obviously have learned a
mm,
different story, all right? You've been told a different truth than the thing that I think is the consensus
mm,
view of where the origin is. And so we have a very intense disagreement here. And I'm not just going to convince you you're wrong. But what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about how we could make a decision. Like, how could we go about resolving this problem? One way we could resolve it is we could think about all the different types of evidence we have at hand. And maybe those evidences are biased by,
mm,
different political entities and so forth. We should talk through that and talk about what the chances are of that being
mm,
influenced that way. And I talked to her as a scientist and a geneticist, like what I see and where that data came from and so forth. There was absolutely no way I was going to convince her that, and I didn't even try to convince her that she was wrong. I just tried to be a human being who tried to
mm,
understand what she was saying and tried to get her to think about, like, how she would try to, what evidence she would provide, how she would, like, try to explain why
mm,
her view is better
mm,
than other viewpoints, and never said, like, you're wrong, just okay. And she walked out of the room, not shaking anymore, not
mm.
crying anymore, um, thanking me for the conversation. And I'm sure still went and told her friends that, this professor, is just, he's a really nice guy. He's just misled. But I'm fine with that. That's better than I'm an arrogant American who's just
Yeah,
forcing a particular
there you
viewpoint
go.
on you. And so you can see how that relates
Yeah,
to the young earth
yeah, there you go.
creationism thing.
All right. Well, you asked for the most challenging questions. So, uh,
Uh-oh.
nope,
That's for the next time.
nope. You asked
Save
for
that
it.
for the
This is
next time.
happening. All right. Top 10 best evidence from science that confirm a young Earth. I know the diamonds are on here somewhere. They gotta be. Helium and radioactive rocks. No, I'm just kidding. We're not doing this. No,
Okay,
no,
what
no.
I'll say
Stop
about,
that.
hey,
Stop.
I will say something about the
No.
top 10. No, I'm going to say something about, I'm not going to
Uh,
go individually through the top 10.
okay,
I'll just
fine,
say this
fine, all right.
one thing. If those are the top 10 things you can come up with,
Okay,
you've got a
all
big
right.
problem.
Those,
I mean,
those are fighting words.
they're not very good. I mean, like, if that's the top 10 out of hundreds of thousands of possible evidences you could bring forth to show that the world is young, that's the best you can do, then your hypothesis has a long way to go to convince anybody.
All right, Dr. Duff. Those are fighting words.
Yeah. Well, you said bring it strong, so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be a little more, I'm trying to be more
Yeah,
YouTube-ish for
you
you,
let us
okay?
down on the other end. Shoot. Um, so, all right, last question for you. So, you know, big part of this is like, young earth creationist worried about that evolutionary teacher, okay, maybe that's resolved. All right. But when someone comes to your class, I mean, you're basically teaching them evolution or whatever. And that surely that's going to cause some doubts, right? Uh, if you think that does happen, like how does those usually happen? I mean, do you usually end up just convincing them, or do you have a lot of people that come to you with doubts about evolution, or what does that look like?
Oh yeah, I have a lot of people come with doubts, and again, I don't ever say that they, like I said before, they don't need to make a like a decision. I'm not like trying to say like this is something you have to decide on today. I also have a lot of graduate students. You'd be surprised how many graduate students I've talked to. They come to graduate school and they have been in science for a while, and you can kind of make it through. And honestly, you can get through undergrad with really kind of like not knowing a
Mm,
whole lot about evolutionary biology. In most programs, you might like have maybe a couple weeks. Now we have a whole class, so every major has to take a whole semester class on evolutionary biology. But a lot of institutions, you can't. If somebody tells you like, "Oh, I went to college and I got a biology degree, and therefore I'm an expert in evolutionary biology," I'd be like, "Well, what did you take?" Because most of our grads, even if they've taken evolutionary biology, are nowhere near an expert in evolutionary biology. Um, I just forgot what the question was. Uh,
student doubts about Christianity
yeah,
because you taught them evolution.
yeah, okay, yeah. You're asking me how do I feel about potentially putting a student in a position where they change their mind on maybe some important doctrinal issue, like they decide I can no longer believe in a literal Adam and Eve, if we want to
Mm,
just get right down to the nitty gritty of it. Um, Now, this is where I might be different than other classes they might take, right, from
mm,
somebody who's not a Christian, because that is a topic that I won't necessarily push at all in class. If I get questions about it, I'll give them two or three different ways to potentially understand that within a scientific framework. Um, I'll say, here's what the scientific evidence suggests. And our best way of understanding that is that it's hard to understand the human population ever being smaller than a couple thousand individuals. Um, but that is what the consensus understanding of genetics is, population genetics is today. And so yes, everyone would have to deal with that, right? They have to weigh like how important is that particular piece of evidence, and how important is my other piece of evidence, my scriptural understanding of Adam and Eve. And I'd say, but maybe what might happen is you can't resolve it, right? There might be issues you can't
mm,
resolve for your entire life. That doesn't mean because you can't resolve that question that you can't say, you know what, a lot of evolutionary biology actually makes a lot of sense. And it could explain a lot of things about this world and a lot of things about the diversity of life. And this might be God's way of making all that other diversity. I just can't personally accept that part of all that diversity is the origin of Adam and Eve from animal ancestry or something like that. That might be where a student is at. And I leave it as that's fine, right? That's something that every one of you
mm,
kind of has to grapple with. And so what I've done in class is I might present them a bunch of things that make them think about evolution in different ways. And so now they're going to have to start to sort those things out and say like, well, I used to think that only, God made every single species, and every single characteristic they have today that they see was something God specifically
mm,
made for that particular species. And then after taking my class, we're like, well, now that really can't be, because I can see that, these things are so similar to each other that they share a common genome. And I can see how that variation would have been formed and how they could have changed as they adapted to different environments. Well, now what you've done is you've started to accept some evolutionary, a lot actually of evolutionary biology. And now you're incorporating that into your thinking, but maybe it doesn't actually touch on any really important doctrine, right? It hasn't made you like completely change your view of the doctrine of sin or something, right? Yeah. But there are going to be those places where there's going to be some touchy things. I don't really deal with the origin of life because I say like that was a long time ago, and it's hard to actually even
mm.
investigate that scientifically in some ways, because there's so many variables and so many unknowns. And so that's probably always going to be a question, and that's always going to leave room for a variety of different hypotheses, some of which are purely scientific hypotheses, and others that are a combination of scientific explanations combined with metaphysical or non-scientific explanations. And so that's kind of a side topic, and that's not really a central
Mm.
topic in evolutionary biology. Most evolutionary biology textbooks really don't deal with the origin of life. And it's not necessarily that I think they're afraid of dealing with it. It's just like, no, the topic of evolutionary biology is kind of mostly about what governs the
Mm.
diversity of the life around us today. What are the rules by which organisms are playing by, right? How is it that populations are changing? That's, I hold my evolutionary textbook up and I say, like, 3/4 of this book is going to be population genetics and what's happening like over the last couple of years with organisms. Like, what are all the mechanisms that are causing organisms right now outside to be able to interact with all the other organisms and adapt and change to them, right? That's most of what you're going to learn in this class. And then there's kind of like this, right? Well, when we can apply this to the history of the earth and ask questions, like bigger questions about the origin of
Mm.
complex characteristics and the origin of major groups of organisms. That's a minor part
Mm.
of evolutionary biology. So if students want to just not think about that so much, because maybe that hurts their brain because they're trying to sort that out with other views they have, they can kind of not have to do that. And they can sort of learn all this other stuff about evolutionary biology, and they can
Yeah.
be better biologists for it because they can learn like how do viruses change and
Mm.
what's happening with the coronavirus, because that's all population biology and population genetics, which is
So
evolutionary
what you're
biology.
saying is you can be a young Earth creationist and an evolutionist at the same time. Hmm.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Now, I mean, this is why I don't know if I want to go down this track, but this is why Ken Ham and others like to define evolution in a very large way, right? Evolution, he always puts it in parentheses afterwards, molecules to man. Why is it molecules to man? Because that includes the origin of life, because you just have molecules and then you
Mm.
go all the way up to making man. And so you say, like, if you believe in evolution, then you believe in all of that. Well, then of course that's going to attack all kinds
Yeah.
of other theological, or they're going to raise lots of other theological issues. Um, what he doesn't want his audience to really think about is the fact that the vast majority of what is under the umbrella of evolutionary
Mm.
biology or evolutionary theory involves things that I think everybody really
Mm.
can accept. Now they might not accept the timeline, right? So you can accept, like, because this is what young Earth creationists do. They say like 50 different species of canines all evolved from a common ancestor that got off the ark. And evolutionary biology would look at that and go like, okay, I agree that they all came from common ancestor, but they couldn't have done that in 4,000 years. Like the population genetics and all the stuff from the 3/4 of the book that they've learned shows that just doesn't work. We don't know of any way that can happen, at least in
Mm.
today's understanding of genetics. So what they do is they just compress it into like, oh, well, everything just happened much faster, or like, we don't know the exact mechanisms. We'll find out future ones and so forth. But all they're saying is we have an altered view of evolution, right? It's
Mm.
not evolution. It's just a different understanding of
Mm.
evolution. But that doesn't sound good to an audience where you've taught them that it's either evolution or
Mm.
creation, and
Right.
there's no in
Right.
between.
It's much more simple that way. Sadly,
Oh
things in
yeah.
life aren't always that simple, sadly. But that's also why, like,
No, but we're
yeah,
wired to want
right,
answers, and we want simple answers because
yeah,
then we don't have to think,
exactly.
you know? And so if I don't have to think, I can
Mm.
just go on to the next
Yep,
thing
the
in my
Bible's
life.
always clear. Interesting coincidence. There's spectrums
Yeah.
there. Yeah, no, that's why I like people like Marcus Ross and Todd Wood. They're willing to, they obviously they try to be open-minded and what they're doing, and they're willing to, not push people's buttons, but like, go the extra mile if they think the evidence is there. So that's certainly respectable, I think. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so this has been fun. Um, Sorry, you guys can't get the top evidences against young Earth creation or for young Earth creation. I'm sorry, guys. Uh,
Sorry,
we're
not
not
this
gonna
time. Maybe
own
next time. We'll spend 5 hours. We'll go through
five.
the
I hope
entire
it wouldn't take
list.
5 hours. Shoot. We're not gonna own you this time.
Hey, if we're gonna do it, you got to do
Okay.
a thorough job.
Okay. Yeah. No, this has been a lot of fun. Everyone, make sure to like and subscribe. Uh, Dr. Duff has a lot of great stuff on his channel, talking about young Earth creationism. If you want to hear the best of, why scientists don't accept young Earth creationism, definitely go check out his channel. And you also probably even learn more about, the teachers and professors of young Earth creationism too. Yeah. But anyways, yeah, this has been a lot of fun. And any last words for everybody?
No,
Oh,
keep on
keep on
learning.
learning. And yeah.
Keep on thinking. Don't
And
settle
if
for the
if you
simple
want to be
answer.
a student for Dr. Duff's class, how do they do that?
I'm sure the University of Akron would gladly accept your tuition dollars. And my class this summer, both of my classes this summer, which start next week, are both asynchronous online, so
Oh
you can take them
man,
from
wow,
anywhere.
advertising for the college.
So literally, if you want to take my evolutionary biology class in the space of 5 weeks, all my lectures are
Oh my
prepared and
gosh.
ready to go.
Lovely. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. All right. This has been fun. I hope you have a good night, Dr. Duff. Oh, yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
you too. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye bye.